Both Johns have done an excellent job in presenting the substance of the problems we face as a nation and the threats to our security. I want to say just a word about, as new graduates of this fine institution, as you move into organizations at more senior levels than you've been before, how does one get organizations to do something useful and not get mired down in their own rules and bureaucratic behavior? I have 3 suggestions on these lines. First is to remember that not everyone is good at everything. Actually, virtually no one is. But the point of that is that frequently in selecting peers or others to take a role, to move forward with a group, one stays away from people who have made a mistake, from people who have a reputation for having done something wrong once, who have made a bad call. I want to suggest to you the career of one James Madison, the author, almost by himself, of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Not by himself, but he was the dominant presence entirely for the American Constitution. It has now lasted 2 1/3 centuries under the same republic, beginning in the spring of 1789 when Washington was sworn in. In that 2 1/3 centuries, not everyone else has been as fortunate as we to have James Madison as the architect of their political cohesion. In those 2 1/3 centuries, France, for example, has had not one, like us, but 5 republics, 2 dictatorships, 2 kingdoms, and a reign of terror. We have done better, and the reason is very heavily Madison. One can make the case, I think, that he is the greatest lawgiver of human history. He certainly is the greatest of the United States and the greatest of the West. But when he became president and served in that capacity as president and commander-in-chief during the War of 1812, he was, not to put too fine a gloss on it, blitheringly incompetent. He was the first and I believe only American president, commander-in-chief, to take the field of battle in wartime. And at the Battle of Bladensburg, where he sought to defend Washington, the British triumphed completely, conquered the surrounding area and Washington, D.C., burned pretty much everything in the city they could burn, except, of course, the Marine barracks, which held out against the British. But it was a terrible set of occurrences. Madison and his wife Dolly had to flee across Chain Bridge to not be captured by the British. They put the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington in their wagon as they fled the British troops. It was a devastating and awful day in American history. And the point is, you can't be a better lawgiver than James Madison. You also almost can't be a worse commander-in-chief. Not everybody is good at everything. So if you are on a promotion panel or a panel to decide who is going to be honored in some way, and you have a long list and you come across someone who may have done some things reasonably well, but he went bankrupt one time. Well, take him off the short list. We don't want to honor a bankrupt. Except there are a few footnotes here. The German government decided a few years ago that they were not leading the world in science and inventiveness the way they once did. And they put together a national commission. To their credit, they wanted to understand why they weren't. Someone, I forget his name, wrote in to the Economist magazine a very short letter when this commission was set up, and he said, I can save the Germans a great deal of time. He said, this is not hard. He said, I spent the first 30 years of my life in Germany, worked here as a young man, and then I moved to California and have worked for the last 20 years in Silicon Valley. He said, in Germany, if you have ever failed at anything, especially if you should have gone bankrupt, the chance that you would even get a telephone call returned from someone like an investment banker with money to provide is nil. And the chance that you would actually get to have a visit, a face-to-face visit with someone like an investment banker is absolutely zero. He said, on the other hand, here in Silicon Valley, we wear our bankruptcies the way Prussian officers used to wear their dueling scars. That is the spirit of fail and try again, fail and try again, fail and try again, and that is the sorting mechanism, not whether someone has failed, but whether he has come back. We have, for example, an interesting situation, which is that of the American presidents, their ratio of bankruptcy to population, that is, number of bankruptcies per president, is 20. It is 20 times larger than the ratio of bankruptcies for citizens of the United States. Presidents and people who run for president are risk takers. And they go bankrupt, like Jefferson did, like Lincoln did. It and other individual failings don't mean you shouldn't give people a second try. Give the guy a chance. Second process that I would strongly recommend is to build Gemeinschafts. Now, that German word basically means the village common. It means and it also means, by implication, an organization that is not based on formal agreements and rules, but rather on common spirit and common undertaking. If you and a neighbor both have sheep that graze on the village common, you may well find that someday you fall sick for a few days. You would expect your neighbor to take care of your sheep. That's what it means to be a Gemeinschaft. It is a spirit of cooperative effort, which is somewhat at odds with the other German word that describes a very different type of organization, Gesellschaft. Gesellschaft is a corporation, an institution that functions by rules, an institution that does not allow departures from those rules, an institution that does not focus particularly on its common spirit and what it can accomplish, but rather on never violating a rule. Well, the problem is that sometimes one needs to operate in a way which is more creative than it's possible to operate on entirely in a Gesellschaft. I had an experience of this sort when I was Director of Central Intelligence. We had in the CIA come up with an idea, which was that we might take a small drone designed by an Israeli-American designer that had been funded by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, but the designer had, yes, gone bankrupt, because none of the 4 fine air forces attached to each of our 4 services thought it was a good idea to spend any money at all on an aircraft that did not have a pilot in it. So there was no particular interest, and the designer, Abe Karam, went bankrupt. I'd known him in other capacities, and I had gone to the Pentagon and said, how much would you guys think it would cost, and how long would it take for us to work together on a much larger drone to do a number of different jobs? And they said, well, we'll do a study. And they went ahead in their Gesellschaft way, did a study, and they came back and said, well, we figure in 5 years for $600 million we can have a prototype. I said, well, don't call me, I'll call you. And I went to Abe, and I said, Abe, I know you went bankrupt, but if I could come up with a little bit of money somehow, how long would it take, and what would it cost for you to expand the size of this little drone, Amber, and turn it into something really militarily useful? He said, oh, I guess probably about 6 months and $5 million. I said, well, you're a couple orders of magnitude better than the Pentagon on at least that estimate. Let's see what we can do. I'll go see Charlie Wilson. So I went at my comptroller's suggestion to see Charlie, who was a wonderful, wonderful man. His only real motivation was patriotism and helping the country. He was from a safe district in Texas, but he didn't need anything for his district, and his seat was safe. He just spent his time trying to figure out how to help the country. I would sit with him in his office, and we would sort out a few $100,000, tiny, in the different parts of the defense budget and the CIA budget. And he'd say, Jim, I think I can move this $750,000 from this Air Force program because they're not going to go on contract this year. Let's use that for the drone. And in the meantime, can you come up with $500,000 from this part of the CIA's R&D budget? And we'd sit there and do it. And I said at one point, Charlie, shouldn't you be having hearings and markups and things like that? He said, yeah, normally we would, but we can make this work. Yeah, can you come up with the $500,000? We put the money together, and that's what became Predator. Now, someone once toasted me at a big dinner as the father of the Predator. I was not. Abe Karam was the father of the Predator, and the wonderful woman, a CIA officer who pulled everything together electronically, was the mother. I was, for those of you who speak Yiddish, the Shadchan. I was the matchmaker in the shtetl who goes back and forth between the boy's family and the girl's family and sets up the marriage. And Shadchan is a good function. In any case, we were able to proceed because Charlie Wilson was willing to work the problem through the spirit of wanting to do something for the country. He figured out a way in which he could. And finally, with respect to this Gemeinschaft approach, my favorite Gemeinschaft is the Skunk Works that Kelly Johnson put together at Lockheed Corporation back in the years right toward the end of World War II. Kelly was the lead aircraft designer of the world for all practical purposes for years, and his aircraft that he designed were stunningly effective and major jumps over what had been there before, going back into the 40s. He decided that he could be more creative and he wouldn't put it this way, if he formed a Gemeinschaft within the Lockheed Gesellschaft, if he formed a spirit of cooperation that operated informally but completely to turn this one little hangar, slightly larger than this ballroom, into the most remarkably creative, technical, several hundred square meters in the world. Kelly started out by convincing Lockheed executives that although it was Lockheed money and he was part of Lockheed, he didn't want any of them ever coming in his Skunk Works. And being wise and knowing something about his successes, they said, all right, if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. Kelly had only one rule that I knew of. I visited the Skunk Works one time while it was still functioning. Amazing thing. He had one rule, which was that no engineer could work more than 100 feet away from whatever it was he was designing. So if you visited the Skunk Works, you would see a group of young engineers, and back in those days, this is 77, with their slide rules, and stand-up desks designing this thing that was taking shape 100 feet from them. And when they got to a point that they needed to, they'd take their paper and go out, and the older craftsman who was putting the wing together they'd talk together, and he'd hold up to that, and the engineer would say, no, we want to cut here. Okay, that was, the whole Skunk Works worked that way. Spirit of craftsmanship and technical invention. A mathematician who worked for Kelly, Russian speaker, read Russian mathematics books and articles in his spare time, because the Russians have always been very good at mathematics. He saw in something that was public, the Russians had published, but they didn't understand, that if they began to angle the fuselage and the wings in a certain way of an aircraft, that they could keep the radar signals from bouncing back to where the radar was, but rather diffuse them in all sorts of different directions. Kelly saw right away what that meant. That became stealth. And when I visited him in the spring of '77, just coming into working for the U.S. Navy for 3 years, I was stunned to go out to the Skunk Works and see what he had come up with. He and his deputy, Ben Rich, absolutely revolutionized aviation. And it was because he understood that not everything can function in a formalistic fashion according to rules. Sometimes you have to say, I don't care what the manuals say. I want to get my engineers and my craftsmen working together this way, and no, Lockheed, stay out. Finally, so rule number 2, as far as I'm concerned, is do your best to build Gemeinschafts. My third and final, I would express it by saying call it straight, stick to your guns, and protect those who do. You may have seen in the press relatively recently, 50 Defense Intelligence Agency employees have been writing and going to the Inspector General over the fact that they have effectively been ordered to make current international policy of the United States government look more effective than it is. That sort of thing happens with intelligence organizations. One is pressed to, can't you just angle it a little bit more this way? Nothing is more destructive of an institution's reputation and its ability to serve the country than lying about what you come up with. If what you come up with doesn't make what we are doing now a good idea, the people up the line from you have to know that. It doesn't mean you get to decide, but it should mean that you get to call it straight and keep calling it straight. My favorite example, I'll close with this, of a person in greatness, I think, in a league with James Madison and Kelly Johnson. A person whom I knew and worked for 3 years, who was superb at all aspects of running and creating organizations and putting teams together, and especially superb given his bipartisan spirit and lack of getting tied to an individual administration or party. My favorite individual in this regard, and in many others, is Paul Nitze. Nitze's name is on the Zeiss building down on Circle, and he served in every administration from the last Roosevelt administration to Carter, and was extremely influential in setting the structure, particularly the beginning structure back in the late 40s, of the direction we would take as a strategy in the Cold War. But I got to know him in a rather odd way. As I said, this particular requirement is not only to call it straight and stick to your guns, but protect those who do. And it's a very important aspect. Well, the way this came about is in my senior year in law school, 67, 68, although I had supported the Vietnam War for several years, I finally grew very impatient at search and destroy, thought it was a bad idea, thought it had to change, and together with 2 other law students, we formed Yale Citizens for Eugene McCarthy for president. And I interviewed lots of candidates who wanted to go up, the anti-war spirit was building, who wanted to go up to New Hampshire and do something effective. I made everybody get clean for Gene, get haircuts, shave, shine their shoes, get a clean shirt, and be very polite when you knock on someone's door and say, "I'd like to talk to you about why Gene McCarthy should get your vote." We pushed that very hard, were somewhat of the laughingstock of the Yale campus, until McCarthy got 42% of the vote in the primary in early 1968. And within weeks, Lyndon Johnson had stepped down from running again for the presidency, and those Westmoreland and McNamara, with whom we strongly disagreed, were effectively out of the government. We weren't quite sure what role we had had in it, but we certainly had been on the side that we thought should win. Within 2 months, I reported to the Pentagon on active duty as a second lieutenant working on intelligence matters because of an article I'd written in a publication about cost effectiveness analysis and how to use it. As I started working in the Pentagon, a friend of mine from college got engaged to Paul Nitze's daughter. Now, Nitze was gone from the government because the Republicans had come in and he had been in a Democratic administration. So we had an invitation to a black tie dinner, a black tie engagement party, several hundred people, all of the Washington establishment at the F Street Club in Washington, and it was the first black tie event I had ever gone to in Washington, and this was quite a deal. Somehow, going through the receiving line, with him holding a glass of champagne and me holding a glass of champagne, Lieutenant Woolsey got himself into a loud and angry argument with Deputy Secretary of Defense Nitze about the Vietnam War. And it wasn't a straightforward pro-war, anti-war thing with Nitze. It was much more complicated than that, but it picked up pace and speed. He's poking at me with his champagne flute. I'm poking back. I'm retreating. It's like a young upstart challenging D'Artagnan. I'm pinned against some windows in the living room of this very fine club, and Paul's wife comes and pulls him off of me, and everybody goes in to dinner. Well, I figured this isn't going to matter because this is early January, and he's only going to be around another 2 weeks, and then the Republicans come in with a new administration. But after about March, Nitze was back because he got always invited back into all administrations. And I get a call from my boss, Charles Rosati, later the head of American Managements, and he said, "Jim, could you come down to my office?" I said, "Yeah, sure." So I went down. I said, "What is it, Charles?" He said, "Nitze's back." I said, "Yeah, I thought I heard something about that. What's he doing?" He said, "Well, he's going to go over to Helsinki and Vienna and negotiate with the Soviets about our strategic weapons and their strategic weapons. It's a new thing called arms control. And he needs an assistant. He needs somebody to draft the statements and do the research and go with him, travel with him and go with him when he goes to negotiate. Would you be interested in doing that?" And I said, "Well, I can't really think of anything that I would rather do as a second lieutenant in the Army than go negotiate with the Soviets in Helsinki and Vienna with Nitze." But I said, "You know, I've only met Nitze once, and it didn't go real well." And Rosati smiled. He said, "That must be what he meant." I said, "Oh, what was that?" He paused for a minute, Charles said, and then he grinned, and he said, "Yeah." He said, "That's okay. Send Woolsey on up. He may not know what the hell he's talking about, but at least he'll speak up."